Welcome to Ad Hoc, because what the internet needed was another white man's opinion. I'd been thinking about starting this channel for a while, and I had a lot of video ideas that I wanted to put on it. Look for one later this week on copyright law, which is sure to entertain and be very useful for insomniacs. But then tonight I saw Game of Thrones, and I had feelings. So like everybody else, I ran to the internet to tell everyone my feelings on the pretense that anyone gives a shit. They don't, but let's go. So, if you have not seen the latest episode of Game of Thrones, this is going to contain massive spoilers. I don't feel bad. I've given you lots of opportunities to leave, like when you turned it on and saw a dude pontificating. But I want to talk about the episode of Game of Thrones because there was a lot of things that happened in it and a lot of things that I think were to the detriment of the series and not necessarily how things should have gone or could have gone. The first caveat is this is absolutely my opinion. If you disagree with it, that's fine. Don't threaten to kill me. The first thing I wanted to talk about is what we say we want to show versus what we actually show, because I think there was a lot of disparity between those things in this episode. And that comes up specifically if you watched after the episode and listened to the producers and the writers and the directors of these last few episodes talking about what their goals for the episode were. One of their goals that they talked about was they wanted to have a very street level view of what was happening because, and this is not a direct quote, but it's the spirit of their words, far too often they said, we see the hero, the protagonist's view of what's happening, but we don't see a ground level view of what it looks like from the people who are experiencing what the protagonist is doing. There's a lot to be said for that, and that's very true. A lot of works of fiction, when you take a step back and think about it, have what you can see found on the internet as protagonist-centric morality, where the things that the protagonist does are correct because we are living in the protagonist's head, we see their motivations, we see their struggles, and so we have an understanding of why they had to do what they had to do. That's a valid thing to look at and take apart, right? Like if you look at the prequels for the Star Wars movies, if you are not living in the Jedi's heads, the Jedi are kind of horrific. They are a militant, monastic, religious order that have kill authority from the government based on not just violations of those own government's laws, but also on their religious distinctions. The difference between a Jedi and a Sith to the guy selling death sticks in the bar is absolutely meaningless. That's a religious distinction between two orders he probably does not belong to and does not care about. So it's good to be able to take a step back and look at what the actions of heroes look like from the people who are on the street having to survive them. Unfortunately, that's not what they showed in the episode. If that was their goal, they failed miserably, because what we actually saw was a street-level view of what war crimes look like, of what the most grotesque acts of war look like, and how they affect people and what bodies they leave behind. And that's not in and of itself bad. Game of Thrones has been incredibly good at showing the concept of, while the nobles are fighting for the throne, while the aristocracy are arguing over very abstract matters of honor and control and power, the people on the streets either don't care or get swept up, caught up, and killed by them. But I think a lot of the episode is built around that idea that, oh, we know what Daenerys has lost, we know what Daenerys has gone through, therefore we sympathize with Daenerys and need to be shown what that actually looks like to the people of King's Landing. The problem is, as I said, Daenerys absolutely committed war crimes. What Daenerys did is, in the modern understanding, under the Geneva Conventions, under the international laws of war, absolutely would end up with her locked up in The Hague, right? She during the episode not just took out legitimate military targets with airstrikes, but knowingly and willfully targeted civilian populations. The Geneva Conventions have a very strong prohibition against the purposeful targeting of civilian populations. And even if we look at it from the perspective of, well, Daenerys is a medieval monarch, so she is not going to follow the modern laws of war, what she did is still fairly beyond what we would see. Yes, you have sieges and warfare that, like Game of Thrones has shown previously, sweep up and kill a lot of innocent people, but I think we have moved, the episode shows a move away from Daenerys as, I will do what it takes to take the throne, and Daenerys as the Mad Queen. And again, that in and of itself is not a bad plan, but it is not in keeping with what they wanted to be showing. Their stated goal was to show the street-level view of the things the hero does that we, it is implied, sympathize with because we know their journey. Except I don't think you'll find many people sympathizing with Daenerys when part of the episode is literally showing her zigzagging up streets to make sure to burn everything. It definitely also doesn't help that beautiful cinematography, especially in the final shots with Arya in the ash in the deserted streets, but those are drawing on our cultural memories of terrible things that are debated to this day. Right? In addition to the mother and child holding each other, which is a direct image lifted out of the excavations of Pompeii, a lot of what we're seeing draws to mind things like the firebombing of Dresden, the firebombing of Tokyo, and ultimately the use of nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Things that to this day there is an ongoing argument about military merit and the necessities and exigencies of total warfare versus the morality that we should be upholding even when we are engaged in a pitched battle. And that's fine, and they're going to make that text, but it is hard to understand how, if their view was that Daenerys should be understood because she has lost Ser Jorah, because she has lost Missandei, because she has been betrayed by Varys and Sansa and Jon, that we should understand that, it's hard to reconcile understanding that with the most heinous war crimes and purposeful death of civilians that Westeros has or will ever see, and a depopulation that would look bad to this day. As creators, as creatives, as people putting our narratives out into the world, we have to understand not just what our intention was, but what it looks like. The story that we're telling and the story that is being perceived. In gaming, this gets discussed under the much hated or lauded term ludonarrative dissonance, but Folding Ideas offered the idea that there is also a cinematonarrative dissonance, and I think if Denisov and Weiss are being genuine in what they wanted to show versus they showed us, this is a clear example of cinematonarrative dissonance, because we did not get a sympathetic character who has been pushed to the edge through the framing, through the emphasis of her dressing and looking more like her brother, through the use of imagery that to a modern audience, to the audience that they are shooting for, is coded as the worst acts of war, and possibly with the ash falling, with the destruction around, with the dazed and bloody people, the worst acts of terrorism. They did not accomplish that in the way they wanted to, and I think if their goal was to engender any sympathy for Daenerys' downfall, they failed miserably. I also think it's important to talk about consistency and payoff. They talked in the interview after the episode about how Daenerys has always had a very cold reaction to the death of her enemies. And they showed the death of Viserys, and they showed some other clips. Daenerys has always been willing to push and take her enemies' lives by whatever means necessary. And so they tied that into the idea that that's what's happening here, and especially absent the Council of Missandei, absent the Council of Jorah, absent the counsel she trusted from Varys and Tyrion, this is what she does. But I don't think that's true, and that's where we get to consistency and payoff. My ultimate problem with the Mad Queen Daenerys arc is that it is not what she was built as. From very early on, we had a distinction between her and her brother. And Viserys was the one, oh, you don't want to wake the dragon as I beat you and sell you to people for marriage so I can go conquer. And if Dany has been somewhat monomaniacal about her claim to the throne and taking it back, she has nonetheless been one of the characters that has most been about saving those common people. And even in this episode, she talked about our mercy is our strength. But she tied it into our mercy towards future generations who will never live with a tyrant being an acceptable reason to burn the people of King's Landing. That does not seem to jive with the Daenerys that frankly went out of her way above and beyond and embroiled herself in conflicts that were not helpful to her goal of taking the Iron Throne. When she freed the slaves, when she took out Slaver's Bay, when she became the breaker of chains. It did not look like she was stressed to the breaking point. It looked like she had known she would have to do this all along. In terms of the framing, in terms of how she looked, she was obviously was emotionally distraught and broken by the death of her second dragon, by the death of her longtime friend and advisor and servant, Missandei. But even that coldness which we have seen when she is killing her enemies does not seem to match the lengths that she has previously gone to embrace her role as being a freer of people. And in a similar problem to the Avengers, no one calls her out that her philosophy is buck wild, is absolutely wrong. Tyrion doesn't say, and maybe it's because Tyrion knew he would push too far, but Jon doesn't say, no one says, what you're talking about is not mercy. What you're talking about is dictatorship. And that could be textual, but if they were going for a subtle breaking point to the point where she becomes the Mad Queen, I think they skipped subtle and went to non-existent. Dany needed to be showing more of that change and needed to be more called on it to pay off that she has gone crazy, that she has become the Targaryen. Because even the justification that they offer, Varys quotes the famous line from earlier seasons and from the books, when a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a dice and the world flip a coin and the world holds its breath. I can talk well. But the problem is Daenerys is not a newborn. That coin hath been flipped. And so far, she has been the sane one. So you can't justify, oh, well, she was always crazy, because we don't see that. She was ruthless, she was a little monomaniacal, but she was not a monster. And we have then seen her go to being a monster in an episode without a lot of consistency to who she was, and without a lot of payoff. Point 3, Clegane Bowl. Clegane Bowl was mostly satisfying. It went almost exactly the way that I think it should. Sandor Clegane knew he was not getting out of there alive. Gregor Clegane has not had independent thoughts until he saw his brother again for a while. So it went exactly as it should have. I liked Gregor breaking free because of prior programming that worked. I liked Sandor not even sparing a look for Cersei. He does not care. The Hound is here for one thing, and that one thing is not the would-be Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. So Clegane Bowl was fine. Nothing would ever live up to the hype that we had built up in our minds, but it went the way it should. It paid off the setup that it had been setting up for multiple seasons since season 1. So where do we go from here? During the episode, I said that I could be okay with how things went if they made it all purposeful, right? Daenerys cast herself as this breaker of generational violence and unjustness, and she got 90% of the way there. To make any of this worth it, I think they need to go the rest of the way and show in the final episode 90% isn't good enough. Game of Thrones is locked in the internecine but constant or constantly reoccurring generational warfare of a lot of medieval kingdoms. George R.R. Martin put it all out there when he had the Starks and the Lannisters standing in for the Yorks and the Lancastrians. I don't know why I said that so weird, but go with it. And it could be that he's building up to, the show is building up toward the same resolution, where the answer is not a York or a Lancastrian or a Stark or a Lannister, but someone who kind of has a claim on one of the sides but is a third party and is going to settle things by burying that feud. But I don't know who that is. So barring the end of the War of the Roses being the end of the War of the Seven Kingdoms, I think the answer has to be that this ultimately is about violence and warfare and how difficult it is to climb out of those things that bind us to hatreds and to greed and want for power and want for revenge. One of the most effective parts of Babylon 5, the television show written by J. Michael Straczynski, was that the character of Jakar went from someone who, in an earlier episode, when some of his people were killed, cut his hand and counted out the drops of blood as dead Narn, and told the commander that blood cries out for blood, to being a peacemaker. It showed the radical transformations that we need to break free from the cycles that have bound us. Game of Thrones can still deliver something of a satisfying ending if it leans into a kind of optimism despite the annihilation. But what I'm afraid of is that it will ultimately lean into the nihilism. It will show us humanity cutting humanity forever in the darkness, but it will not show us that there can be growth from that toward a better state. I am afraid that where we go from here is ultimately just an embrace of nihilism for the sake of embracing nihilism. And maybe that's where George R.R. Martin wanted to go all along, but I don't know if they can make that land. I don't know if you can make that land, because I don't think that's what they've been setting up before. Game of Thrones has always been about idealism and cynicism and honor and practicality and people trying to be better, and even when those people are getting murdered from all sides, someone else takes up that banner. I don't know if the purely cynical ending of almost everyone is dead, the Seven Kingdoms are shattered, and no one is left to take the Iron Throne is an ending that we can be satisfied with. Other just quick miscellaneous impressions in this literally an hour later reaction. There was some beautiful cinematography. The effects were great. They drove home the terror of being on the ground when a dragon is roasting an entire city. The cinematography could have been about from a World War I or World War II movie. They drove home a lot of that symbolism, and then they drew on some symbolism with the pale horse covered in blood, animals surviving in the midst of the bombings that I mentioned, and also the famous biblical quotation, "And I beheld a pale horse." There was a lot of good in the episode, but ultimately I feel like it has been part of a rush toward resolution for the sake of resolution, rather than a rush toward resolution that they were building toward. This has been Ad Hoc, and I would call this a hot take, but that seems a little too soon. Have a good night.